The night my life was destroyed began with a lie. And the worst part was that everyone in that room believed it. I was 27 years old, exhausted from labor, holding my newborn baby in my arms when my mother-in-law looked at me with the kind of cold smile that makes your stomach drop. Margaret Coleman didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. In the Coleman family, her word was law. The mansion in Boston was filled with people that evening, family members, attorneys, and a few close friends who had come to see the newest heir of the Coleman dynasty. The Colemans were old money, generations of influence, banks, foundations, private trusts. And I was the outsider who had somehow married into it. At least that's how Margaret always described me. I met David Coleman when we were both finishing graduate school in Boston. He was charming, confident, and completely uninterested in the family empire his mother controlled. That was one of the reasons I fell in love with him. He wanted a normal life. At least that's what he told me. For the first 3 years of our marriage, we lived in a brownstone in Back Bay. Nothing extravagant. Just the two of us building our careers and planning a future. Then Margaret got involved. She insisted the first Coleman grandchild had to be born under the family roof. David resisted at first, but Margaret had a way of turning resistance into obedience. By the time I was 8 months pregnant, we had moved into the Coleman mansion. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it would be fine. I was wrong. Margaret watched everything I did, what I ate, where I went, who I spoke to. She had opinions about my clothes, my work schedule, even the way I arranged the flowers in the dining room. But the strangest part was the way she looked at my pregnancy. Not with excitement, with suspicion. One evening she asked a question that still echoes in my mind 15 years later. "Are you certain the child is David's?" I remember laughing because the idea was so absurd. But Margaret didn't laugh. She just stared at me with those sharp gray eyes. From that moment on, something in the house changed. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Staff members avoided eye contact. And David became distant. I blamed stress, his work, my pregnancy hormones, anything but the truth. The night I gave birth, a snowstorm covered Boston. David rushed me to Riverside Medical Center just before midnight. The delivery was difficult, but when they finally placed my baby in my arms, the world became quiet.
A boy. Perfect. Healthy.
I remember crying from relief. David kissed my forehead and whispered, "He's beautiful." For a moment, everything felt right again. But by the time we returned to the mansion 2 days later, Margaret was waiting in the main hall like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. Behind her stood David and 2 family attorneys. That was when my heart began to pound. Something was very wrong. Margaret stepped forward slowly and looked down at the baby in my arms. Then she looked at David. "Tell her." David avoided my eyes. My voice shook. "Tell me what?" Margaret answered instead. "The child you're holding," she said calmly, "is not a Coleman." The words felt unreal. "What are you talking about?" She nodded to one of the attorneys. He handed David a folder. David opened it with trembling hands. "A private investigator," he said quietly, "confirmed you were meeting another man during my business trips." My entire body went cold. "That's not true." Margaret's smile returned. "There are photographs." Inside the folder were pictures. Blurry. Grainy. A woman who looked like me standing beside a man in a parking garage.
Except it wasn't me.
But in that moment, no one cared about the difference. David's voice cracked. "My mother thinks the baby isn't mine." The room began spinning. "David, you know that's impossible." Margaret's tone hardened. "The Coleman family will not raise another man's child." My grip tightened around my newborn son. "You can't be serious." Margaret turned to the staff waiting near the door. "Pack her belongings." I felt like I had stopped breathing. "You're throwing me out?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "You will leave tonight." David said nothing. That silence hurt more than the accusation. I looked at him, desperate. "David, you know me." For a moment, something flickered in his expression.
Doubt. Pain.
But Margaret stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. and whatever resistance, he had disappeared. "You should go," he said quietly. The sentence shattered something inside me. Snow was falling when they pushed my suitcase onto the front steps. I stood there in the freezing Boston night, holding a 2-day-old baby, while the doors of the Coleman mansion closed behind me. Margaret's final words followed me into the darkness. "This family will forget you ever existed." 15 years later, I would make sure they never forgot my name again. For the first 3 months after that night, I barely survived. Boston in winter is cruel enough when you have a home. When you don't, every gust of wind feels like a reminder that the world has decided you no longer belong in it. I had a newborn baby, 1 suitcase, and exactly $412 in my checking account. The Colemans had already frozen the joint accounts David and I shared. Margaret didn't just throw me out of the house. She erased me from the family. Every lawyer in Boston who had once greeted me warmly suddenly became unavailable. David never called. Not once. But I learned something important during those first weeks. When people believe you are weak, they stop paying attention to you. And that gives you space to rebuild. My parents had died years earlier, so there was no family to run back to. The only person who helped me was an old professor from my graduate program at MIT, Professor Alan Green. When I showed up at his office with a baby carrier and red eyes, he didn't ask for explanations. He simply listened. Then he made 1 phone call. 2 weeks later, I was on a flight to London with my son. Professor Green had arranged a junior analyst position for me at a small investment firm run by a former student of his. The salary was modest. The hours were brutal. But it was an opportunity. And I had nothing left to lose. London became the place where I stopped being Sarah Coleman and started becoming Sarah Mitchell again. During the day, I worked. At night, I studied markets, financial models, and corporate strategy while my baby slept beside my laptop. There is a strange kind of clarity that comes when your entire life collapses. You stop worrying about approval. You stop worrying about reputation. You focus only on survival. And survival turns into strength. My son grew quickly. I named him Ethan. He had dark hair and calm, thoughtful eyes that seemed far too wise for a child. From the moment he could walk, he followed me everywhere. When he was 4 years old, he used to sit quietly in the corner of my office with coloring books while I finished late-night reports. My colleagues thought it was unusual, but no one complained, because the firm was growing, and so was my reputation. Within 6 years, I had become the youngest partner in the company. Within 10, I bought it. That was the year Northbridge Capital was born. What started as a small investment group became something much larger. We focused on restructuring failing companies, finding value where others only saw collapse, saving businesses people had already written off. Investors liked results, and results came quickly. By the time Ethan turned 14, Northbridge Capital managed billions in international assets. We had offices in London, Singapore, Zurich, and Toronto. But the most important thing I built during those years wasn't the company. It was control. I controlled my finances, my decisions, my future. No one could throw me out ever again. Still, there was one place I had never returned: the United States. For 15 years, I avoided it.
Boston,
Chicago, New York. Every city connected to the Coleman family felt like a door I wasn't ready to open. Until one evening changed everything. It happened in my London office on a quiet Tuesday. My assistant placed a thick folder on my desk. "A charity investment opportunity," she said. "Large American Foundation." Normally, I would have ignored it, but the name on the cover stopped me. The Coleman Children's Trust. For a long moment, I just stared at the words. The foundation was Margaret's pride, a public symbol of the Coleman family's generosity. Scholarships, hospitals, education programs. The perfect mask for a perfect family. I opened the file slowly. Financial statements, donation reports, annual charity gala. Location, Chicago.
guest list.
And there it was. Margaret Coleman, chairwoman. David Coleman, executive trustee. My fingers tightened around the page. 15 years. 15 years since the night they threw me into the snow with a newborn child and a lie. According to society pages, David had remarried. His wife's name was Vanessa. They had a son, Tyler Coleman, the heir to the Coleman name, the life that was supposed to belong to my child. I closed the folder carefully. For a long time, I sat in silence. Ethan was 16 now.
Tall.
Polite. Brilliant in school. Everything I had fought to protect. He deserved peace. But justice deserved patience. I picked up the phone and called my board chairman. I want Northbridge Capital to become the primary sponsor of an American charity foundation. He sounded surprised. Which one? I looked again at the name on the file. The family that destroyed my life. The Coleman Children's Trust. There was a pause. Then he asked the only question that mattered. How large an investment? I stared out the window at the London skyline. Large enough, I said calmly, that they can't say no. Because after 15 years, I was finally going home. The first time I saw David Coleman again was under a chandelier worth more than my first apartment. 15 years had passed, and yet the moment I stepped into the ballroom, it felt like no time had passed at all. The charity gala was being held in Chicago at the Grand Astoria Hotel, one of those places designed to impress people who are already rich. Crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, walls lined with photographers waiting to capture the generosity of powerful families. And at the center of it all was the Coleman name. Banners across the ballroom read, "The Coleman Children's Trust, Annual Hope Gala." I arrived late on purpose. Powerful entrances require timing. My car pulled up quietly outside the hotel while cameras flashed at the main entrance. I stepped out wearing a black evening dress that was elegant but simple. Nothing extravagant. Confidence didn't need decoration. Inside the ballroom, hundreds of guests filled the room. Politicians, corporate donors, socialites. And near the center stage stood the woman who had once destroyed my life. Margaret Coleman. She looked older, of course. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, and the same cold authority surrounded her like armor. Some people grow softer with age. Margaret had only grown sharper. Standing beside her was David. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. His shoulders were heavier now. His posture slightly tired. But the face was the same. The man who had once looked at me like I was his entire future. The man who watched silently while his mother threw me out. Beside him stood a woman in a glittering gold gown. Vanessa. I had seen her photographs in society magazines. She was beautiful in a polished, expensive way. The kind of woman who looked like she had never struggled a single day in her life. Her hand rested possessively on David's arm. And standing slightly behind them was a teenage boy. Tyler Coleman.
The heir.
The boy who had grown up in the life my child had been denied. I felt something twist inside my chest. But my face remained calm. The stage lights brightened as Margaret stepped forward to address the crowd. Her voice carried easily across the room. For 3 generations, the Coleman family has believed in one principle, that privilege comes with responsibility. Polite applause followed. She continued, "This year we are honored to welcome new partners who share our mission to support children and families across the country." My cue. At the back of the ballroom, the event coordinator approached Margaret and whispered something into her ear. I watched her expression carefully. First confusion, then surprise, then something much darker. The microphone squealed slightly as Margaret adjusted it. "It appears," she said slowly, "that we have received an extraordinary new donation this evening." Guests leaned forward with interest. Tonight, the Coleman Children's Trust welcomes its largest single sponsor in the foundation's history. Murmurs filled the room. Margaret read from the card in her hand. Northbridge Capital. For a moment, the name meant nothing to the crowd.
But not to David.
I saw the recognition hit him instantly. His head snapped toward the entrance. And that was when I began walking forward. The room slowly parted as guests turned to look. Whispers followed me across the ballroom. Some people recognized my name from financial news. Others simply sensed something unusual was happening. Margaret's grip on the podium tightened. David looked like he had seen a ghost. I stopped a few feet from the stage. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then Margaret broke the silence. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the tension. Sarah. The room erupted into confused murmurs. David's face had turned pale. Vanessa looked back and forth between us, trying to understand. I offered a polite smile. Good evening, Margaret. The photographers sensed drama and rushed closer. Cameras flashed rapidly. Margaret forced a thin smile. I wasn't aware you would be attending. Neither were you aware of the donation, I replied calmly. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. David finally stepped forward. Sarah, how? I looked at him directly for the first time in 15 years. His eyes searched my face like he was trying to confirm I was real. I'm the CEO of Northbridge Capital, I said simply. Gasps echoed around the room. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Yes, she said coldly. We've become aware. Vanessa spoke for the first time. Her voice carried sharp curiosity. David, who is this woman? David didn't answer. So I did. I'm his first wife. The ballroom fell completely silent. Even the orchestra stopped playing. Vanessa slowly removed her hand from David's arm. Margaret stepped forward quickly, trying to regain control. Well, she said, forcing a smile for the guests, how wonderful to reconnect with old acquaintances. But I wasn't finished. I looked at the crowd, then back at Margaret. My company believes strongly in supporting children's charities, I said. Another flash from a camera lit the room. That's why Northbridge Capital will be investing $50 million into the Coleman Children's Trust. The audience exploded into applause. Margaret's smile returned, but I saw the fear hiding underneath it, because she understood something the others didn't. Money doesn't just buy influence. Sometimes it buys access. And tonight, I had just bought my way back into the Coleman family's world. That night in Chicago changed everything, but not in the way the Coleman family expected. After my announcement, the gala continued with forced smiles and carefully controlled conversations. Margaret made sure the program moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened. But every person in that ballroom knew something was wrong. Whispers followed me everywhere. People from the financial world approached to congratulate me on the donation. Socialites pretended they remembered me from years ago. And through it all, I could feel Margaret watching, calculating. She had spent her entire life controlling situations like this. But this time she hadn't seen the move coming. Eventually the crowd shifted toward dinner tables and the orchestra resumed playing soft jazz. That was when David approached me.
Alone.
He stopped a few feet away, as if unsure how close he was allowed to stand. For a moment neither of us spoke. 15 years is a long time. Long enough for anger to cool, but not long enough for memory to disappear. You look different, he finally said. I allowed myself a small smile. Most people do after 15 years. He nodded slowly, still studying my face. I thought you left the country. I did. And now you're back. For business. He glanced across the room toward Margaret, who was speaking quietly with several board members. You didn't donate $50 million just for business. No, I said calmly. I didn't. He looked like he wanted to ask more questions. But another voice interrupted. David. Vanessa had joined us. Up close, I could see that she was even more polished than the photo suggested. Perfect makeup. Perfect posture. The kind of elegance that comes from a life without uncertainty. Her eyes moved between us carefully. You didn't tell me your ex-wife was this Sarah Mitchell. Her tone carried the faint edge of someone who suddenly realized she had walked into a situation she didn't fully understand. David shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa. But I stepped in smoothly. It's understandable, I said. My life changed quite a bit after Boston. Vanessa's smile tightened. Yes, I've heard. There was silence for a moment. Then another voice spoke.
Dad.
The boy standing beside Vanessa stepped forward. Tyler Coleman, 16 years old, tall for his age, with the confident posture of someone raised in wealth. But there was something else. Something strangely familiar. His dark hair. The shape of his eyes. The calm seriousness in his expression. For a second my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. Tyler, David said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is
Sarah.
Tyler looked at me politely. "Nice to meet you." His voice was steady, respectful, very different from the arrogant air I had expected. "Nice to meet you too," I replied. Vanessa rested her hand on his back proudly. "Our son." The word echoed quietly in my mind. Our son. Across the ballroom doors opened again. A staff member approached me. "Ms. Mitchell, your son has arrived." David's head lifted immediately. "Your son?" I nodded. "Yes." The doors opened wider, and Ethan walked in. He was the same age as Tyler.
16.
Tall, composed, wearing a simple navy suit that suddenly felt very small compared to the luxury around him. But Ethan had something most people in that room didn't. A confidence that didn't depend on money. He spotted me immediately.
"Mom."
His voice was warm, steady. The moment he reached my side, I placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Everyone," I said calmly, "this is my son, Ethan." David stared at him like the air had left his lungs. Tyler and Ethan looked at each other curiously. Two boys. Same age. Standing only a few feet apart. Neither of them understood the strange tension that suddenly filled the room. But I felt it. Deep in my chest. Something unexplainable. Something unsettled. Tyler spoke first. "You're from London?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah. My mom runs an investment company there." Tyler smiled slightly. "That's cool." Ethan returned the smile. For a moment, the two boys looked almost similar. Not identical, but enough to make the feeling in my chest grow stronger. David noticed it too. His expression had turned pale again. Margaret approached just then, her voice cutting through the moment like ice. "Well," she said, her eyes moving between the boys, "what a fascinating coincidence." Her gaze lingered on Ethan, then on Tyler. For the briefest second, something in her face changed. Not anger, not suspicion.
Fear.
And that was the moment I realized something important. The Colemans believed they had buried the past 15 years ago. But standing there in that ballroom, with two teenage boys facing each other for the first time, it felt like the past had just walked back into the room. Power doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly. That's something Margaret Coleman had understood for most of her life. Unfortunately for her, it was also something I had spent 15 years mastering. The morning after the gala, the board of the Coleman Children's Trust scheduled an emergency meeting. Officially, it was to welcome Northbridge Capital as a strategic partner. Unofficially, Margaret wanted to understand why I had returned. The meeting took place in the Foundation's Chicago headquarters, a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. The building was impressive.
Modern.
Elegant. Exactly the kind of place wealthy donors loved to photograph themselves visiting. But buildings can lie. Numbers rarely do. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habits. Preparation is a form of control. The conference room overlooked the lake, sunlight reflecting across the long mahogany table where the board members slowly gathered. Margaret entered last. She didn't greet me. She simply sat at the head of the table like a general preparing for war. David sat 2 seats away from her, still looking unsettled from the night before. Vanessa wasn't part of the foundation board, but she arrived anyway. Margaret allowed it. That told me something. Vanessa had influence. The meeting began politely. Introductions. Legal acknowledgments of the Northbridge Capital sponsorship. Then Margaret folded her hands and looked directly at me. $50 million is a generous investment. Her voice was calm, controlled. But I assume your company expects certain oversight privileges. I slid a folder across the table. Northbridge Capital letterhead. Professional. Precise. Standard procedure, I said. Financial transparency, audit access, and operational review. One of the board members frowned slightly. That level of access is usually reserved for trustees. Northbridge Capital now funds nearly 40% of the foundation's annual operating budget, I replied calmly. Silence settled over the room. Margaret understood the implication immediately. Money equals leverage. And I now had more of it inside the foundation than anyone else. Finally, she nodded. Very well. David looked uneasy. You're planning a full audit? Routine, I said. Margaret's eyes studied me carefully. She knew it wasn't routine, but refusing would raise questions. So she said the only thing she could. Approved. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Within 48 hours, my financial team from Northbridge Capital arrived in Chicago. 3 analysts, 2 forensic accountants, 1 legal advisor. Officially, we were reviewing donation allocation efficiency. In reality, we were mapping the entire financial structure of the Coleman Children's Trust. And it didn't take long to find something interesting. The foundation handled enormous amounts of money. Donations, investment income, endowment funds. Most of it was clean. Margaret had always been careful. But people around powerful systems often become careless. 3 days into the audit, one of my analysts knocked on my office door. You should see this. He placed several printed statements on the desk. At first glance, they looked normal. Operational expenses, charity program transfers, administrative budgets.
But then he pointed to a pattern.
Recurring payments, large ones, luxury travel agencies, private fashion boutiques in Paris, 5-star resorts in Monaco, all categorized under Foundation Outreach Expenses. The name attached to the authorizations appeared again and again. Vanessa Coleman. I leaned back in my chair slowly. Total. Over $6 million in the last 4 years. My analyst hesitated. And there's more. He placed another file on the desk. Private credit lines linked to the foundation. Luxury vehicle leases. Designer jewelry purchases. All routed through shell vendors connected to Vanessa. The Coleman Children's Trust. A children's charity. Funding Vanessa's lifestyle. I closed the file calmly. Does Margaret know? We're not sure. I thought about the woman who had once destroyed my life with a single accusation. Margaret rarely allowed anything in her empire without knowing about it, which meant there were 2 possibilities. Either Vanessa had been quietly draining money from the foundation, or Margaret had allowed it. Neither option ended well for the Coleman family. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking Lake Michigan. 15 years ago, they had thrown me out of their world. Now I was inside it, and the deeper I looked, the more cracks I could see forming. Behind me, my analyst spoke carefully. What would you like us to do next? I watched the water for a moment. Then I answered calmly. Keep digging. Because the truth about powerful families is simple. If you follow the money long enough, it always leads to secrets. Money reveals secrets. But sometimes the real answers hide in places no one thinks to check. Like a hospital record from 15 years ago. The idea came to me late one evening in my Chicago apartment. My team had spent a week reviewing the Coleman Children's Trust finances, uncovering Vanessa's quiet abuse of the foundation's funds. It was useful leverage. But it wasn't the truth I had been looking for. Because no matter how successful my life had become, one question had never stopped haunting me. Why had Margaret been so certain the baby wasn't David's? Not suspicious.
Certain.
That level of confidence had always felt unnatural. Accusations usually come with doubt. Margaret had shown none. She had acted like she already knew the outcome, which meant one of 2 things. Either she had fabricated everything, or something had happened the night my son was born. That thought kept me awake long past midnight. So the next morning I asked my legal advisor a simple question. Can hospital birth records disappear? He looked at me curiously. Disappear? Yes. He thought for a moment. Not easily. Hospitals archive everything, especially births. Even after 15 years? They should still exist. Should. The words stayed with me. By noon we had sent a formal legal request to Riverside Medical Center in Boston, the same hospital where Ethan had been born. The request was simple. Delivery records. Newborn identification logs. Staff duty schedules. Standard archival retrieval. 2 days later the hospital replied. The email was polite, professional, and immediately strange. Delivery records for March 14th, 15 years ago. Unavailable due to archive damage. I read the message twice. Then a third time. Archive damage. Hospitals don't lose entire delivery logs. Not unless something unusual happened. I called the hospital directly. After several transfers, I finally reached the administrative records department. A woman named Claire answered. Yes, Ms. Mitchell. We received your request. Your email says the records were damaged. That's correct.
How?
There was a pause. A storage incident. What kind of incident? Flooding. The answer came too quickly. Flooding destroys paper. But most hospitals digitized records long before 15 years ago. Are there digital backups? I asked. Another pause. Not for that particular archive. Now my instincts were fully awake. Too convenient. Too neat. Could I visit the hospital in person? Of course, she said. Though I'm not sure we'll be able to recover anything. I thanked her and ended the call. Across the desk, my legal advisor watched me carefully. You think something's wrong. I think records don't disappear by accident. 3 days later, I was on a flight to Boston. The city looked exactly the same from the airplane window. The harbor, the brownstone neighborhoods, the quiet streets that once felt like home. But I wasn't the same woman who had left. Riverside Medical Center stood on the edge of the Charles River, just as it had 15 years earlier. Walking through the lobby felt surreal. For a moment, I could almost hear the echo of the night I arrived in labor. The pain. David holding my hand. The moment they placed my newborn baby in my arms. A nurse led me down a quiet hallway to the records department. Claire turned out to be a middle-aged woman with careful eyes and the nervous posture of someone who preferred routine. She offered a polite smile. I wish I had better news for you. She showed me the storage archive. Boxes. Shelves. Medical files. But the section labeled March records, year 15 prior, had a noticeable gap. Flood damage. I asked. Yes. Only this section? Claire hesitated. Well, yes. I stepped closer to the shelves. Something about the space felt wrong. The surrounding boxes were dusty. Old. But the empty shelf space was clean. Too clean. Like something had been removed recently. I turned back to her. Claire, when exactly did the flood happen? She looked uncomfortable now. Several years ago. Do you have a maintenance report? Her silence answered the question. I walked slowly back toward the hallway. Claire followed nervously. Ms. Mitchell, if the records are gone, there may be nothing we can do. I stopped at the door. Then asked the question that changed everything. Who was the attending nurse on my delivery? Claire looked surprised. That information should also be in the missing file. But someone must remember. She thought for a moment. Maybe the ambulance driver. I turned. Ambulance driver? Yes, she said slowly. You were brought in during a snowstorm that night. The same driver stayed with the emergency team most of the evening. My pulse quickened. Do you have his name? Claire checked an old staff logbook. Then she spoke the name quietly. Mr. Daniel Collins. I wrote it down. A retired ambulance driver. Present the night my son was born. And possibly the only person left who remembered what really happened in that delivery room. As I walked out of Riverside Medical Center, a strange feeling settled in my chest. For 15 years, I had believed the past was buried. But now it felt like something was waiting beneath it. Something someone had tried very hard to erase. Finding Mr. Daniel Collins took 3 days. Retired ambulance drivers don't usually leave much of a public trail. Most of them disappear into quiet neighborhoods and ordinary routines after decades of long nights and emergency calls. But patience has always been one of my strongest skills. By the 4th day, my investigator finally called. We found him, she said. Where? Small town outside Boston. Quincy. He's 72 now. Does he still remember Riverside? She gave a small laugh. 35 years on the job? I'm pretty sure he remembers everything. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the back seat of a car driving along the gray Atlantic coastline. Quincy was quiet. Modest houses. Small diners. The kind of place where people still recognize their neighbors. Mr. Collins lived in a narrow, white house near the harbor. The yard was simple but well-maintained, with an old wooden bench facing the water. When he opened the door, He looked exactly like the kind of man who had spent decades driving ambulances. Weathered face, strong shoulders despite his age, careful eyes that noticed everything. "Yes, my name is Sarah Mitchell," I said. "I was hoping to ask you about a night 15 years ago at Riverside Medical Center." He studied my face for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. "You were the woman in the snowstorm." It wasn't a question. "You remember?" He stepped aside and gestured inside. Hard night to forget. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and sea air. Photographs of ambulances and hospital crews covered the walls. He sat in a chair across from me. "March storm," he said slowly. "Roads were a mess. Took almost 40 minutes to get you to the hospital." My hands tightened slightly. "You stayed that night?"
Yeah.
Emergency room was overloaded. They had us helping move patients. "Do you remember the delivery?" Mr. Collins nodded. "Your husband was there. Nervous guy." "David." The name still felt strange after so many years. "You had a healthy baby boy," Collins continued. Doctors were relieved. Storm nights always make deliveries harder. I felt a quiet warmth in my chest hearing someone confirm that memory. "Yes," I said softly. "I remember holding him." Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair. "But that's not why you're here."
No.
Silence stretched between us. Then I asked the question carefully. "Do you remember anything unusual that night?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Unusual?" "The hospital says my delivery records were destroyed in a flood." He stared at me for several seconds. Then he slowly shook his head. "Funny thing about that." "What?" "There wasn't any flood." The room felt suddenly smaller. "You're sure?" "I volunteered in the archives for 2 years after retirement. Those files were removed long before any water damage." My pulse quickened. "Removed by who?" Mr. Collins rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I never knew for certain." He stood up and walked toward a cabinet near the wall. When he returned, he was holding an old notebook. "I kept notes during my last few years working," he said. "Just a habit." He flipped through several pages. Then stopped. "There were 2 deliveries that night."
"2."
He nodded. "Yours and another woman who arrived about an hour later. Do you remember her name?" Collins looked down at the page. "Vanessa Carter." The name hit me like cold water. Vanessa, David's current wife. My voice lowered. "She gave birth the same night?"
Yeah.
"Complicated delivery. Baby was weak." My mind started racing. 2 women. Same hospital. Same night. 1 healthy baby. 1 weak newborn. Collins looked up at me again. "You want to know the strange part?" I could barely breathe. "Yes." "That morning," he said quietly, "I saw Margaret Coleman in the hallway outside the nursery. The air left my lungs." "My mother-in-law?" "Yep. She wasn't supposed to be there." Visiting hours hadn't started. My heart pounded. What was she doing? Collins hesitated. "Arguing with a nurse." My voice dropped to a whisper. "About what?" He closed the notebook slowly. I couldn't hear everything, but I remember one sentence clearly. The room felt completely silent now. "What did she say?" Mr. Collins looked directly at me. "Margaret told the nurse, 'This child belongs to the Coleman family.'" My entire body went cold. "And then," Collins continued quietly, "I saw her hand the nurse an envelope. I didn't need to ask what was inside. Money." My voice barely worked. "What happened after that?" He sat back down slowly. "That nurse went into the nursery." Seconds passed. Then he finished the sentence that changed everything. "And when she came out," he looked at me carefully, "she wasn't carrying the same baby she went in with." For several minutes after Mr. Collins finished speaking, I couldn't say a single word. My mind kept replaying the sentence. She wasn't carrying the same baby she went in with. 15 years. 15 years of believing one story. 15 years of raising a boy I loved more than my own life. And suddenly the past was no longer stable. I forced myself to stay calm. "What happened to the nurse?" I asked. Mr. Collins shrugged slowly. "I never saw her again after that week." "Do you remember her name?" He shook his head. "Just that she was new." Temporary staff. Which meant exactly what I feared. No records. No witnesses. Except him. I stood up slowly. Mr. Collins, would you be willing to testify if this ever became a legal case?
He didn't hesitate.
I've carried that memory for 15 years, he said quietly. If someone paid to switch babies, that's not something a man forgets. I thanked him and left shortly afterward. The cold Atlantic wind hit my face as I stepped outside, but I barely felt it, because now the past had opened in a way I never expected. 2 babies born that night. My healthy son, Vanessa's weak newborn, Margaret bribing a nurse. And then the accusations, the photographs, the sudden certainty that my baby wasn't David's. It hadn't been suspicion. It had been preparation. I got into the car and immediately called my legal advisor. We need DNA tests, I said. There was a pause on the line. From who? I stared out at the ocean. My son and David Coleman. 2 days later, my private lab in Chicago received the samples. Obtaining David's DNA was easier than most people would imagine. A charity dinner glass. A napkin. Powerful men rarely think someone is testing them. The harder decision was Ethan. My son. The boy I had raised for 16 years. The boy who had been beside me through every struggle. The thought of questioning that bond felt like betrayal. But the truth had already begun moving. And once truth starts moving, you can't stop it. That evening I asked Ethan to meet me in the apartment library. He arrived carrying a physics textbook. Everything okay, Mom? His calm voice nearly broke my composure. I forced a smile. I need a small favor. What kind? A routine medical test. For a legal matter. He didn't question it. Ethan trusted me completely.
Sure.
The simplicity of his answer made my chest tighten. A nurse from the lab arrived 20 minutes later and collected the sample quickly. Ethan returned to studying like nothing unusual had happened. But I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. DNA testing normally takes days. Northbridge Capital Labs can do it in hours. Still, the waiting felt endless. When the results finally arrived, my hands remained perfectly still as I opened the report. Years of training had taught me how to read complex financial data without emotion. But this wasn't finance. This was my life. The first result appeared on the screen. Ethan Mitchell, biological match to Sarah Mitchell, 0%. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Not my son. The words echoed silently in my mind. I kept reading. Second comparison. Ethan Mitchell, biological match to David Coleman, 99.98%. My breath stopped, which meant only one thing. Ethan was David's child. Vanessa's child. The baby born weak that night. The baby Margaret had decided to discard. My hands moved slowly to the second report. The test comparing David's DNA to Tyler Coleman. For several seconds I couldn't bring myself to open it. Because if the first result was true, then there was only one possible answer. I clicked the file. The numbers appeared immediately. Tyler Coleman, biological match to Sarah Mitchell, 99.99%. My heart pounded in my ears. Tyler. The boy raised in the Coleman mansion.
The heir.
The child standing beside Margaret at the gala.
My son.
My real son. The room was completely silent. 16 years. 16 years raising another woman's child while my own son grew up in the house that had thrown me out. Margaret hadn't just destroyed my life. She had stolen my child and abandoned Vanessa's weak newborn because she believed he wouldn't survive. But he had survived. Ethan had survived. And I had raised him, protected him, loved him. A strange calm settled over me because suddenly everything made sense. Margaret's certainty. The missing hospital records. The quiet fear in her eyes when she saw the boys standing together at the gala.
She knew.
She had always known. I closed the laptop slowly. Across the apartment, Ethan's bedroom light was still on. He was probably studying like he always did. The boy who believed I was his mother. And in every way that mattered, I was. But somewhere across the country, another boy was living a life that had been stolen from him. My son, Tyler Coleman. For 15 years, Margaret had controlled the truth. Now I held it in my hands, and the Coleman family had no idea their entire world was about to collapse. For 15 years, Margaret Coleman had controlled every piece of the board. Money, reputation, family. But power built on lies eventually begins to fracture. And once the first crack appears, everything else follows. I returned to Chicago with the DNA reports locked inside my private safe. Not because I feared losing them, but because timing matters. Revealing the truth too early would only give Margaret time to prepare. And Margaret Coleman had spent her entire life preparing. So instead, I kept doing what I had started. Watching, investigating, quietly tightening my grip on the financial structure of the Coleman Children's Trust. My audit team continued reviewing the foundation's accounts, and the deeper we went, the worse Vanessa's spending looked. Luxury trips, jewelry purchases, private shopping accounts, all quietly routed through the charity's operational expenses. $6 million was only the beginning. The real number was closer to 9. And every signature approving those expenses belonged to the same person, Vanessa Coleman. I didn't expose it immediately. Instead, I sent the full financial report to the entire board, including David, including Margaret. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Margaret arrived first, her expression already tense. She knew the audit results had uncovered something serious. David came in shortly after, holding the report folder like it weighed 100 pounds. Vanessa followed last. Still elegant. Still confident. But confidence fades quickly when numbers start speaking. I waited until everyone was seated before opening the meeting. Northbridge Capital has completed the preliminary financial review of the foundation. The room remained silent. Then I slid the printed documents across the table. Several transactions require explanation. David opened the folder first. His face changed immediately. What is this? Vanessa leaned toward him. Then her expression froze. Margaret didn't move. But I saw her eyes scanning the numbers with frightening speed. She understood the scale instantly. $9 million. Charity money. Spent on Vanessa's lifestyle. David looked at his wife slowly. Vanessa? Her voice was tight. These are operational reimbursements. For Monaco? David asked quietly. For Paris fashion houses? For diamond purchases? The silence that followed felt heavy enough to break glass. Margaret finally spoke. Vanessa. Just the name. Cold.
Sharp.
Vanessa straightened in her chair. The foundation allows discretionary outreach expenses. That clause was intended for charity promotion, Margaret replied calmly. Not private villas. David closed the folder. His hands were shaking now. How long has this been happening? Vanessa didn't answer. Which was answer enough. David stood up slowly and walked to the window, overlooking the city. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he asked the question that revealed how deeply his world had already begun to crack. Is there anything else I don't know? Vanessa's eyes flickered.
Just for a moment.
But I noticed. And so did David. He turned back toward her slowly. What was that look? Vanessa forced a small laugh. You're being dramatic. But David wasn't listening anymore. Because the truth has a strange effect on people. Once one lie is exposed, every other memory begins to feel uncertain. I watched him carefully as he spoke again. Sarah came back after 15 years. He looked at Margaret now. Then we discover millions missing from the foundation. His voice lowered. What else happened 15 years ago? Margaret's face remained perfectly composed. But I knew something important had just happened. For the first time in decades, David Coleman was questioning his mother. And once doubt enters a family built on control, it spreads. Vanessa stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. But David barely looked at her. Instead, he said something quietly that even Margaret hadn't expected. I want a full investigation. Vanessa froze. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You're overreacting. No, David said calmly. I think I've been underreacting for 15 years. The room fell silent again. And as I watched the Coleman family begin turning against each other, one thought moved quietly through my mind. I hadn't even revealed the real truth yet, and they were already starting to fall apart. Margaret Coleman believed she still had control, even as the foundation board fractured, even as David began questioning the past, even as Vanessa's financial scandal quietly spread through the family. Margaret still believed one thing with absolute certainty, that the secret from 15 years ago would never surface, which was why the invitation for the Coleman Children's Trust 25th anniversary fundraiser in Los Angeles was so important. It would be their largest public event in years. Politicians, major donors, national press, television coverage. A perfect stage for the Coleman family to repair their reputation after the audit scandal. Margaret planned the evening carefully. What she didn't realize was that I had been planning it too. The ballroom in Los Angeles was even larger than the one in Chicago. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Cameras, journalists, corporate sponsors. Everything Margaret needed to restore the Coleman image. I arrived quietly, sitting at one of the sponsor tables near the front. Across the room, I could see David.
He looked exhausted.
The past few weeks had clearly taken their toll. Vanessa sat beside him, her posture stiff and tense. The financial investigation had already begun, and Margaret stood near the stage greeting donors with her usual polished smile. But I could see the strain hiding beneath it, because something had changed inside the Coleman family. Trust had started to disappear. The program began with speeches. Donations announced. Applause from the audience. Finally, Margaret stepped onto the stage. Her voice carried across the ballroom. For 25 years, the Coleman Children's Trust has protected and supported children who needed families. I almost smiled at the irony. She continued, "Our mission has always been built on truth, responsibility, and family values." That was my moment. I stood. The microphone in the room picked up the movement instantly. Heads turned. Margaret froze when she saw me walking toward the stage. "Sarah," she said sharply. But I continued forward calmly. "Margaret, I believe the audience deserves to hear the full truth about the Coleman family." The crowd shifted with curiosity. David looked confused. Vanessa's face had already gone pale. Margaret forced a laugh. "This is hardly the appropriate time." "Oh, I think it is," I said. Then I turned to the large projection screen behind the stage. My assistant pressed a button. The first image appeared. A scanned page from a hospital archive. 15 years ago, I began calmly. 2 babies were born at Riverside Medical Center during a snowstorm in Boston. Murmurs moved through the audience. Margaret's face turned completely still. I continued. 1 healthy baby boy. Another newborn in critical condition. The second image appeared. A photograph of Riverside Medical Center's missing delivery records. These records disappeared shortly after that night. David looked between the screen and his mother. "Mom?" Margaret's voice cut through the room. "This is absurd." But I raised my hand. "Then perhaps we should hear from the witness who was there." The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Mr. Daniel Collins walked slowly inside. The retired ambulance driver looked uncomfortable under the lights. But his voice was steady when he spoke into the microphone. "I saw Margaret Coleman pay a nurse the night those babies were born." The room exploded with shocked whispers. Margaret shouted, "This is a lie." But the next slide appeared. 2 DNA reports. Large. Impossible to ignore. I spoke slowly. 16 years ago, I was accused of cheating and thrown out of the Coleman mansion with a newborn child. David stared at the screen, confusion turning to horror. The Coleman family claimed my baby wasn't David's. I pointed to the DNA results. But science says otherwise. The first result appeared. Tyler Coleman, biological son of Sarah Mitchell. Gasps filled the ballroom. Vanessa grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. David looked like the ground had disappeared beneath him. Then the second result appeared. Ethan Mitchell, biological son of David Coleman and Vanessa Coleman. The room fell silent. I turned back toward Margaret. "You didn't just destroy my life," I said calmly. "You stole my child." Margaret's composure finally shattered. "You have no proof that." The nurse took Vanessa's weak newborn and gave him to me. I continued. You told the world I had cheated. You threw me out. You raised my healthy son as the Coleman heir. I gestured toward the audience. All because you believed Vanessa's sick baby would die. Across the room, David staggered backward. His voice broke. Tyler, is it my son? No, I said quietly. He's mine. Vanessa collapsed into her chair. The reporters were already filming everything. Margaret tried to speak again, but the room had already turned against her. Board members whispered. Donors stared in disbelief. And David looked at his mother with a level of betrayal I had never seen before. For the first time in her life, Margaret Coleman had no control left. Security escorted her off the stage as the event dissolved into chaos. The Coleman Children's Trust Board immediately announced a criminal investigation. Vanessa's financial fraud, the hospital bribery, the falsified accusations. Everything would now face the courts. But I didn't stay to watch the collapse. Outside the ballroom, the night air was cool and quiet. Ethan stood beside me. He had watched everything. The truth about his birth. The truth about Tyler. After a long moment, he asked softly, Are you still my mom? I placed a hand on his shoulder. Always. Because biology can explain where a child comes from. But love decides who raises him. Across the city, the Coleman family empire was already beginning to crumble. Margaret had spent 15 years believing she had buried the truth. But lies have a strange habit. They don't disappear. They wait. And when they finally surface, they destroy everything built on top of them. I didn't destroy Margaret Coleman. She destroyed herself.